Karen slaps Janitor for mopping near her. Didn't realize he was the school principal in disguise. The morning sun beamed down harshly on the polished hood of Karen's luxury SUV as she pulled into the parking lot of West Grove Middle School. Her sunglasses perched on the bridge of her nose. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, already brimming with frustration. The nerve of this school. Giving her precious son detention for what? Talking back to a teacher. Unbelievable. Kids had opinions, didn't they? Freedom of speech, or had schools turned into miniature dictatorships now? She slammed the car door behind her, heels clicking furiously across the blacktop as she stormed toward the front entrance, ready to unleash the fury of a mother who believed the world owed her and her son special treatment. Inside, the school buzzed with the usual pre-lunch energy. Students moved from class to class, teachers tried to maintain order, and the janitor worked steadily at the end of the hallway, pushing his mop back and forth across the tiled floor with a calm, methodical rhythm. His uniform was plain, navy blue coveralls, slightly faded with age, a name patch reading Mike stitched over his chest. He was an older man, gray at the temples, his face lined with wisdom and patience. No one really paid him much attention as he worked. He didn't mind. He liked it that way. Karen burst through the main doors with a dramatic flair, the kind that demanded to be noticed. Her eyes scanned the front office and found no one immediately available, which only deepened her scowl. Without bothering to sign in or wait for assistance, she took it upon herself to march directly into the hallway, lips pursed, hands on her hips, her handbag swinging violently as she strode forward. She had one goal: find the teacher responsible for this injustice and demand her son's name be cleared. Along the way, she didn't bother to avoid the bright yellow "Caution, Wet Floor" sign placed neatly in the center of the corridor. She barely glanced at it. Signs were for other people, people who needed instructions. As she neared the janitor, he looked up and offered a polite, soft-spoken warning. "Careful, ma'am, floor's wet." Karen rolled her eyes, brushing past him without even a nod. Her heel landed squarely on the freshly mopped surface, and she immediately slipped, not enough to fall, but enough to make her stumble and scuff the side of her expensive white designer shoes. She gasped as if someone had physically assaulted her. Her eyes went wide with rage as she turned on the janitor, her face flushing red with a fury that bubbled up instantly, irrationally. "You idiot," she snapped, voice echoing down the hallway. "Do you even know how much these shoes cost? Are you blind or just stupid?" The janitor stood quietly, mop in hand, his expression calm but unreadable. He didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't shrink from her aggression. That only made her angrier. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at him, advancing closer. "You're lucky I don't sue this school into the ground. You think you can just swing your little mop around and splash people like me? Unbelievable." He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could utter a word, Karen reached out and slapped him, hard across the face. The sound cracked through the hallway like a gunshot, and everything stopped. A few students passing by froze, mouths agape. A teacher standing nearby dropped her folder. Even the janitor paused mid-breath, blinking once as he slowly straightened his posture. Karen stood there, hand trembling slightly, breathing heavy with indignation, her chest rising and falling rapidly as if she just won some twisted victory. "I'm reporting you," she hissed. "You're done here, you hear me? Fired." The silence that followed wasn't one of guilt or shame. It was heavier, thicker. Something had changed in the air. The janitor didn't speak. He just looked at her, calm and composed, like he was seeing through her rather than just looking at her. Slowly, he wiped his cheek with the back of his gloved hand, returned the mop to its bucket, and pushed the cart aside. Without another word, he turned and walked down the hallway, his footsteps steady and unhurried. Karen stood frozen, momentarily confused by his reaction or lack thereof. She expected groveling, maybe pleading, or at the very least a security guard rushing to remove him. But no one came. No one seemed to care. She turned toward the students nearby and snapped, "Did you see that? He just walked away after attacking me with water. Go get the principal." One of the students, no older than 13, muttered under his breath, "That is the principal. Another kid gasped and elbowed his friend, and the small group quickly shuffled away, whispering intensely to one another. Karen blinked, the words hitting her like cold water. "What?" she said aloud, as if someone had spoken a language she didn't understand. "What did you say?" But the students were already gone, and suddenly the hallway felt different, not just because she was alone, but because the entire mood had shifted. Something wasn't right. She glanced down the hall where the janitor, no, the man she slapped, had disappeared. Her heart skipped a beat as she processed the implications. If he was someone important, if he really was who those kids said he was. "No," she whispered to herself, shaking her head. "He's a janitor, just a janitor." But even she didn't believe it now. A knot twisted in her stomach. She looked back at the yellow sign on the floor, then at her shoes, then at the hallway where teachers were now peeking out of classrooms. Every eye that met hers was filled with something she hated more than anything: judgment. Still fuming but suddenly less sure of herself, Karen pulled out her phone and started typing furiously. She needed to get ahead of this, needed to explain the truth before anyone else could spin a different version. Her fingers trembled as she opened her notes app to draft a complaint. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. Because if that man was the principal, then she hadn't just slapped a janitor. She slapped the highest authority in the school. And he hadn't even raised his voice. Not once. The next morning arrived with a heavy stillness over Westgrove Middle School. Though the sun shone as it always did and the buses rumbled in on schedule, there was an invisible buzz among the students and staff alike. Rumors had a way of traveling faster than truth ever could, and by the time the first bell rang, nearly everyone had heard at least a fragmented version of what had taken place the day before. "Karen slapped the janitor," one version said. "He's really the principal undercover," whispered another. "She's getting sued," some claimed with dramatic flair, while others added their own invented twists. She was banned, arrested, or marched out of the school in handcuffs. Truth didn't matter much in those buzzing hallways. What mattered was that something shocking had happened, and the school was holding its breath for the fallout. In the teacher's lounge, quiet murmurs floated above the clinking of coffee mugs. Ms. Dalka, a language arts teacher who had witnessed the entire incident, sat at the edge of a table, sipping her lukewarm drink and recalling every detail for a group of curious colleagues. She didn't embellish, she didn't have to. The moment Karen's hand had slapped across the janitor's face had been loud enough to echo, and Mike's reaction, or lack thereof, had been even louder. He just stood there, looked at her. Like he knew something she didn't, she said. Then he walked away, calm, like he didn't need to say anything. That woman has no idea who she messed with. Meanwhile, in the main office, Principal Barlow sat behind his desk, not in his janitor disguise today, but in a pressed gray suit with a subtle striped tie. His demeanor was as calm as ever, though the lines in his forehead had deepened just slightly overnight. In front of him sat a small stack of papers, incident reports, witness statements, and a disciplinary file already beginning to take shape. He hadn't yet decided how far this would go. The slap had been public and aggressive, and if it had been directed at any other staff member, the consequences would have been swift and formal. But the fact that he had chosen to wear the uniform of a janitor that day, part of a school climate initiative he had launched to better understand the dynamics between faculty, staff, and parents, complicated things. Karen hadn't known who he was, but that didn't make her actions excusable. If anything, it revealed something far deeper about her character than she likely realized. The intercom crackled softly above the school as students filed into their classrooms. Across the building, the custodial staff worked quietly, aware that one of their own had made headlines among the students. Some grinned privately, proud of the principal for walking in their shoes, literally. Others worried. The last thing they needed was drama tied to their already overlooked roles. Janitors were used to being invisible until something went wrong. It was rare for one to be at the center of gossip, and rarer still to be mistaken for someone of less authority and then disrespected for it. Karen herself, oblivious to the brewing consequences, returned to the school that morning under the assumption that everything had blown over. In her mind, she had done nothing wrong. At worst, she had overreacted, and surely the school would understand once she explained her side. She was, after all, a mother protecting her child. She parked in the visitor's space again, checked her makeup in the mirror, and walked into the building with her head held high. Her smile was forced, her eyes scanning for familiar faces. But something had changed. Where yesterday there had been neutral politeness or even deference, today she was met with avoidance. Teachers she passed didn't smile. Staff looked the other way. Even the front office secretary, usually chipper, gave only a curt nod when Karen asked if her son's detention had been lifted. "He's still scheduled to serve it after school today," the secretary replied, her tone flat. "You'll need to speak with the principal if you have a concern." Karen blinked, the words catching her slightly off guard. "I'd like to do that now, please." "He'll see you shortly. Have a seat." She sat down, legs crossed, tapping her foot impatiently on the floor. Every second felt like an insult. When the office door finally opened and Principal Barlow stepped out, her jaw nearly dropped. Gone was the janitor's uniform. Gone was the mop in the cart. In its place stood the man she had slapped with authority in his stride and a calmness that only deepened her confusion. Her first instinct was denial. "Wait, what is this?" she asked, standing quickly, her voice wavering. He didn't raise his voice, didn't respond with anger. Instead, he gestured politely toward his office door. "Ms. Lasker, please step inside." She obeyed, but the moment she crossed the threshold into his office and sat in the hard-backed chair across from his desk, her confidence began to unravel. The principal remained standing for a moment, gathering a paper from his desk before sitting down slowly, folding his hands neatly in front of him. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking, and the silence stretched so tightly that she felt herself shrinking beneath it. "I am Principal Michael Barlow," he began, voice even and measured. "Yesterday, I was dressed as part of an ongoing initiative to better understand our school environment. I've done this in the past. It helps me see things I wouldn't from behind this desk. But during that time, while performing custodial duties, I was assaulted by a parent." Karen opened her mouth to interject, but he held up one hand, not aggressively, but firmly enough that she understood to remain quiet. "You didn't know who I was," he continued. "That much is clear, but that isn't the point. The point is how you treated someone you believed to be beneath you. The slap, Ms. Lasker, is secondary to the disdain, the insults, and the entitlement. You acted with no patience, no empathy, and no understanding." Karen's face paled. She tried again to speak, her voice faltering. "I didn't mean I was just upset. I have written reports from 3 teachers and 5 students who witnessed the incident," he said. "It was loud, it was aggressive, and it was completely unacceptable behavior, especially in front of children." Tears threatened to form in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was the one who had been wronged. Her shoes had been soaked. Her pride had been wounded. And now here she was, being scolded like a child by the man she had tried to humiliate. "I have not decided yet whether to pursue legal action," Principal Barlow said. "But I will be filing a formal report with the school board. In the meantime, you are not permitted on campus grounds until further notice. Your son may remain enrolled, but any future meetings or conversations will be conducted virtually or off-site." Karen stared at him, her mouth open, speechless for the first time in recent memory. The silence that followed was deafening. "You may go," he said softly. And so she did, walking out of the office, past the stairs, past the judgment, unsure whether her world had just shrunk or whether she was finally seeing its real shape for the first time. The car ride home felt longer than usual, though the streets of the neighborhood hadn't changed. Karen gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled tension, her mind racing with 1,000 overlapping thoughts that refused to settle. The quiet hum of the engine did little to drown out the echoes of Principal Barlow's calm, measured voice replaying in her head. Every word he had spoken to her had been soaked in restraint, yet each syllable had cut deeper than any shout or threat could have. He hadn't humiliated her. No, that was the worst part. He had simply laid the truth in front of her, like a mirror too clean to ignore. She had gone into that meeting expecting to intimidate, to demand, to fix the situation on her terms. Instead, she had been dismissed like a schoolchild sent home with a disciplinary note. The shame, unaccustomed and unwelcome, gnawed at her with a fierceness that startled her. Once inside her home, she paced the living room, arms folded tightly across her chest, the click of her heels against the hardwood floor echoing like a metronome of rising anxiety. Her phone sat untouched on the kitchen counter, silent and still, though a dozen group chats from fellow mothers and social acquaintances were likely exploding with speculation. She couldn't bring herself to look. She had always held herself up as the one in control, the one who knew the system, who stood above the fray and corrected others with an iron will and a condescending smile. But today that image had cracked, and through it seeped a creeping self-awareness she didn't know how to contain. By late afternoon, her son, Lucas, returned home, kicking his backpack off as he entered. He was a typical middle schooler, smart-mouthed, easily embarrassed, and in many ways a reflection of her unchecked habits. As he grabbed a soda from the fridge and flopped onto the couch, he offered her a glance that was more curious than affectionate. "Mom," he muttered, "what did you do at school yesterday?" The question caught her off guard, not because she didn't expect it, but because she hadn't prepared an answer that sounded as good out loud as it did in her own defense. She hesitated, then forced a sigh that she hoped sounded more exhausted than guilty. "I handled a situation. Your teacher gave you detention unfairly, and I spoke to the staff about it." Lucas looked at her flatly, his eyes narrowing. "You slapped the janitor." Her stomach dropped. She laughed, a hollow, forced chuckle that cracked halfway through. "That's not what happened. I was upset. He was careless with the mop and I reacted, but he wasn't even a janitor. He tricked everyone. He's the principal." Lucas blinked slowly, like he was watching someone explain away a disaster they couldn't admit causing. "Everyone knows. People were talking about it all day. I heard 8th graders making fun of you. My friends were asking me if you really hit him. Ms. Dalka said you're banned from campus." Karen felt the weight of her actions slam into her all over again. It wasn't just the staff who knew, it was the students. Her son had become the punchline of a story that would likely be retold in whispered laughs for weeks. She had tried to fight for him, or so she told herself, but instead she had made him the center of ridicule. And now, in the heavy silence between them, she saw it clearly in his posture, the embarrassment, the confusion, the distance. She opened her mouth to defend herself further but stopped. What could she say that wouldn't sound like a lie? That she was provoked? That the wet shoes justified her behavior? That she didn't mean to hit someone who turned out to be in power, as though hitting anyone else would have been acceptable? "I'll fix this," she murmured, though it was more of a promise to herself than to him. Lucas just shrugged and turned on the television, his attention shifting, but the air between them remained thick and strained. The next day, Karen stayed home, watching the hours crawl by, expecting a phone call that never came. She imagined school board meetings, administrators murmuring in dark rooms about her conduct, her name passed around like a warning label. She couldn't shake the image of Principal Barlow's face, so calm, so unreadable. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't condemned her. He had simply shown her who she was by doing nothing at all. That indifference was worse than outrage. It meant he didn't see her as a threat, just as a disappointment. By the third day, something inside her shifted. Pride had always guided her actions, but now pride offered her no comfort. She opened her laptop and began typing. First, a message to the PTA group chat, then an email draft to the school administration. The words came slowly at first, stiff and defensive. She wanted to explain, to rationalize, to carve out a version of events that made her look like a misunderstood hero. But each time she tried to shape the truth into something else, her fingers stalled on the keyboard. So she deleted it all and started over, this time with just one line. "I need to apologize for what I did." The simplicity of it startled her. She reread it 5 times, fingers hovering above the keys, unsure what to say next. She added more, confessing the slap, the attitude, the misplaced anger. She admitted that she didn't know who the janitor was, but that her behavior had been unacceptable regardless. She addressed the staff, the students who witnessed it, and even her son, acknowledging how she had embarrassed him by failing to control her emotions. It wasn't elegant or eloquent, but it was honest in a way that made her chest tighten as she typed. When she finally hit send, she sat back in her chair, the stillness of the house pressing in around her. There was no instant relief, no dramatic swell of music, just the ticking of the kitchen clock and the slow drip of accountability. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was the first step on a path she hadn't realized she needed to walk. That evening, Lucas came home again, quieter than usual. She met him at the door, not with anger or questions, but with a calm she had borrowed from the man she had once slapped without thinking. "I sent an apology to the school," she said gently, "and to your principal." Lucas looked at her skeptical. "Why?" She didn't dodge the question. "Because I was wrong, and if I want you to be better than me, I have to be willing to admit when I've messed up." He didn't say anything, just nodded and passed her by, but the nod was more than she expected. It was small but real. Karen watched him disappear into the house and exhaled slowly, the weight still there but no longer crushing. Maybe there was still room to change. Maybe this story wasn't over. The next week unfolded like the slow unspooling of a tightly wound thread, every moment stretching under the weight of the previous week's events. Karen moved through her days in a subdued haze, a stark contrast to the confident, quick-tempered woman the school community had come to know. Her email, which she had painstakingly written and sent to the school staff and administration, had been acknowledged but not replied to with any warmth or forgiveness. There were no follow-up messages, no responses offering absolution, just a stark and formal confirmation from the school secretary stating her apology had been received and noted by Principal Barlow and the school board. It was the kind of professional neutrality that left her more rattled than if they had berated her. It suggested she was no longer worth the time of a personal reply, and that stung more than any reprimand. At home, things were no less tense. Lucas had begun to withdraw. Where once he would chatter about school drama or the latest trends, now he mumbled responses and holed himself up in his room. Karen heard the muffled sound of his friends on group calls and caught whispers of her name when he didn't realize she was nearby. She had become a source of embarrassment, the mother who slapped someone at school and became the subject of memes and lunch table jokes. Karen tried to make up for it in small ways. His favorite snacks in the pantry, new sneakers she knew he'd had his eye on, letting him off the hook for chores, but nothing softened the chilly barrier that had risen between them. She had damaged not only her reputation, but her relationship with the person she claimed to be defending in the first place. But what struck her the most was the silence from Principal Barlow. She had expected a formal reprimand, perhaps a sit-down with the school board or a mandatory apology session in front of staff. But instead, he had left her to stew in the quiet space of her own consequences. The lack of retaliation was unnerving. She realized now that she had built her entire approach to conflict on the expectation that there would always be a reaction, anger, defensiveness, counterattacks. But Principal Barlow had denied her all of that. He had responded with calm, with grace, and in doing so, had exposed just how out of control her own actions had been. By midweek, Karen received a call, not from the school directly, but from a fellow parent on the PTA, a woman named Melissa who spoke with a tone that balanced between forced cheerfulness and tightly restrained judgment. Melissa informed her that the upcoming PTA meeting had been rescheduled, and that Karen's presence, while technically allowed, would not be encouraged until further notice. "Some of the other parents are still processing things," she said delicately, as though Karen had committed a faux pas at a garden party instead of publicly slapping a school employee. Karen thanked her numbly and hung up the phone, staring at the blank television screen in front of her. She had been slowly excised from the community she once tried to lead with an iron grip, and for the first time in a very long time, she had no say in it. The next morning she woke early, earlier than she had in weeks, compelled by a strange, uneasy energy. She showered, dressed in something plain, and for once didn't spend half an hour perfecting her makeup. There was no one to impress. Today wasn't about appearances. She packed a small envelope into her purse. Inside was a handwritten note, a real one, written on thick paper in the careful cursive she hadn't used since college. It was addressed to Principal Barlow, not an email, not a text. Something tangible, something that couldn't be ignored with a single click. She arrived at the school just after classes had begun, standing at the front office window with both hands visibly clutching the envelope as though it were a peace offering. The secretary gave her a measured look, neither warm nor hostile. Karen offered a quiet greeting and simply asked if the envelope could be passed along. The secretary nodded without comment and placed it gently into the day's mail stack. There was no request for a meeting, no demand for a reply, just the note. Inside the envelope, the letter was brief but sincere. Karen admitted she had behaved disgracefully. She acknowledged that she had not only disrespected a man doing his job, but had done so in front of children who learned more from actions than lectures. She admitted she hadn't just embarrassed herself, but had set a dangerous example for her son, one that had fractured their bond. Most importantly, she made no excuses. She didn't cite stress or confusion or misidentification. She said simply, "I was wrong and I am sorry, not because I was caught, not because of the fallout, but because I looked at another human being and saw someone I thought didn't deserve kindness, and that shame is mine to carry." She didn't expect a response. She didn't need one. Writing the letter had been more for herself than anything else, a symbolic act of humility that had taken her nearly 40 years to learn how to perform. That night when Lucas came home, she didn't press him for conversation. She let him eat in silence, do his homework uninterrupted, and vanish into his room. But hours later, as she was washing dishes, he appeared in the doorway, hands stuffed in his hoodie pockets, eyes avoiding hers. "Ms. Dalka said Principal Barlow read your letter in the staff meeting," he said without preamble. Karen turned slowly, water dripping from her hands. "What?" she asked, trying not to sound too eager. Lucas shrugged. "She said he didn't say your name out loud, just said he received a personal apology from someone who realized they had more growing to do. Said it was the kind of letter that reminded him why second chances mattered." Karen's throat tightened. She wiped her hands, unsure what to say, afraid that any response might ruin the fragile moment. Lucas shifted on his feet. "People aren't making jokes anymore. It's kind of old news now." She nodded, lips pressed into a thin, careful line. "I'm glad." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "It was a good letter." And with that, he turned and walked back down the hall, leaving her standing there with her breath caught in her chest, the tap still running, and the faintest thread of hope beginning to weave its way through the silence. Friday arrived with the crispness of a spring breeze rolling in early, the kind that made the air feel lighter, as if something heavy had finally passed. The school, once again bustling with the daily rhythm of students hurrying to class and teachers juggling morning prep, had regained its usual energy. The story of Karen's outburst, once the dominant undercurrent of conversation, had begun to fade from prominence, replaced by newer distractions and the ever-turning wheel of school life. But for Karen, the end of the week carried a different weight. It marked a personal checkpoint, a quiet culmination of a transformation that had begun in humiliation and slowly bloomed into self-awareness. She had not been back on school grounds since she delivered her letter, and she had no intention of returning uninvited. But when she received the email that morning, a short, formal message from Principal Barlow inviting her to a closed-door staff meeting, her hands trembled slightly as she read it. It was not a demand. It was not an ambush. It was, in fact, something she never expected, an opportunity. She arrived 10 minutes early, dressed modestly in dark slacks and a pale blouse, her makeup minimal, her posture neither defensive nor arrogant but softened by humility. The front office buzzed quietly around her as she waited, the staff greeting her with cautious nods rather than the sharp-edged stares she had endured a week earlier. There was still a distance, but no longer outright hostility. In a way, she was grateful for the neutrality. It meant she had stopped being a spectacle and started becoming a person again. When the secretary finally led her into the staff room, Karen felt her heart begin to race, but she held herself steady. Inside the room were about a dozen teachers, a few administrative staff members, and Principal Barlow at the far end, standing with a clipboard in his hand. He looked up as she entered and gave a small nod, not a smile but not cold either, an acknowledgement of her presence, her effort, and perhaps her growth. Karen took the seat nearest the door, more out of instinct than strategy, as though part of her still feared she might need a quick exit. But no one told her to leave. No one rolled their eyes. The room was quiet, expectant, and as Barlow cleared his throat, all attention turned to him. "Before we begin," he said, his voice carrying with its usual calm gravity, "I want to take a moment to address something personal that's impacted many of us here." He didn't look at Karen directly, but everyone knew. Last week, we witnessed a moment of conflict and disrespect. It was public, it was painful, and for many, it touched a nerve about how we treat one another, particularly those we assume hold less power. Karen felt her chest tighten but didn't look away. She kept her gaze level, her hands clasped together in her lap, resisting the urge to fidget. Barlow continued. Since then, the individual involved has not only acknowledged their mistake but went further than required, offering a sincere and private apology to both myself and this institution. I chose to share part of that letter with our staff because I believe in the power of accountability and, more importantly, the power of change. Now, he did glance at Karen, and though it was brief, there was no disdain in his eyes, only something resembling respect. We often tell our students that growth comes from owning your actions, learning from them, and doing better. That lesson shouldn't stop with children. It applies to all of us, regardless of age or position. Today, I invited that individual here not for public shamming, but because I believe in modeling what reconciliation can look like. Karen felt the heat rise in her cheeks as the room shifted, all eyes turning toward her. She stood slowly, the movement deliberate, her voice quiet but firm when she finally spoke. "I don't expect applause," she said, scanning the faces around her, "and I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm here because I needed to stand in front of the people I disrespected and say, directly, that I was wrong. I acted out of entitlement, frustration, and a sense of superiority that I've had the luxury of never being challenged on, until now." She paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "What I did in that hallway was unacceptable. Not just the slap, but everything leading up to it. The way I talked down to someone I thought was beneath me. The way I assumed I had the right to be heard louder than everyone else. And if it had been any of you or any staff member, I would be just as guilty." She swallowed hard, her voice catching for a moment. "But I'm trying to be different. I've spent the last week listening instead of talking, thinking instead of reacting. And I've realized that if I want my son to grow up to be the kind of person who respects others regardless of their title or uniform, I have to be that example." There was a stillness in the room after she finished speaking, the kind that isn't awkward but reflective. No one clapped. No one jumped to pat her on the back. But that was fine. That wasn't why she had come. She didn't need validation. She needed to show she had learned. Principal Barlow offered a slight nod before turning back to his clipboard, and with that, the meeting moved on to standard agenda items, safety protocols, upcoming events, volunteer opportunities. Karen remained seated, listening quietly, even contributing once when a suggestion for a community cleanup day was mentioned. It was the first time she had spoken as part of a group rather than at it, and though her voice trembled slightly, no one dismissed her. When the meeting ended, people trickled out in small clusters. A few teachers gave her polite smiles. Ms. Dalka even touched her shoulder gently as she passed, offering a nod that Karen understood to mean she'd earned some measure of trust back. It wasn't everything, but it was a beginning. Outside, the sun had risen higher, casting a warm light across the sidewalk. Karen walked back to her car at a slower pace, her posture relaxed for the first time in days. As she approached the vehicle, she heard a voice call out behind her. Ms. Lasker. She turned to see Principal Barlow walking toward her. No clipboard now, just his hands tucked in his pockets. "I wanted to say," he began, "your letter and what you said today, those things matter. Not everyone would have come back." Karen nodded, the wind brushing lightly through her hair. "I almost didn't, but I realized that if I only show up when I'm right, I'll never really grow." He smiled then, small but genuine. "Growth is rarely comfortable, but it's always worth the effort." She nodded again, and this time the silence between them wasn't tense, it was understanding. As she got into her car and drove away, Karen didn't feel vindicated or victorious. She felt something quieter, something deeper, a strange calm that comes when you finally stop running from your own reflection. The story that had started in anger and arrogance had ended in humility, and maybe, just maybe, that was the real lesson all along.